And convicted child killer Robert Howard was responsible, on the balance of probabilities, for the death of County Tyrone schoolgirl Arlene Arkinson, a coroner has found. Arlene was just 15 when she went missing in 1994 after a night out in Bundoran in County Donegal. Howard was charged with her murder in 2002 but acquitted of the charge. He died a few years ago while serving a separate sentence for the rape and murder of another teenage girl in England. Barry Cummins, Primetime's security correspondent, knows the case of Arlene Arkinson well. Barry, remind us what happened to her.
On a Saturday night in August 1994, Louise, Arlene Arkinson was one of 3 teenagers to go out, take a lift with Robert Howard. They went from Castlederg in County Tyrone over to Bundoran in County Donegal. Arlene had no idea of the history of Robert Howard. She just knew him as Bob, and Bob was from the Irish Midlands. He was living in Castlederg and he was going out with a woman in the area. So she took a lift and went with her friends over to this disco, and was then brought back to Castlederg by Bob Howard in the early hours of the Sunday morning. The 2 friends got out of the car first and were dropped off, and then the last they saw of Arlene and the last sighting of her alive was of her getting out of the back of the car, getting into the front passenger seat and heading off towards Castlederg. Robert Howard later told the RUC that he dropped her home, but he started giving different narratives as to where he had dropped her in Castlederg. He then started looking for alibis from his then partner and other people to say he was home at certain times, but the police believe he didn't arrive home until around 9:30 in the morning, which would give him about a 6-hour window to have committed the murder of Arlene Arkinson and to have hidden her body, because to this day her body still has not been found.
Now, he was tried and ultimately acquitted 20 years ago, but at the time, Barry, of that trial, he was already actually serving a sentence for the rape and murder of another young girl in London. Is that correct?
It is, and even to go back before that for a moment, Louise, when Arlene Arkinson got into that car to take a lift, she had no idea that at that time Robert Howard was facing charges of raping a teenage girl in Castlederg. She also had no idea, nor did the wider community, that Robert Howard was a convicted rapist. He had attacked a woman in Youghal in County Cork in 1973, and he had attacked a child in Durham in England before that in the late 1960s. So this man had been travelling around Ireland and Britain for years, committing various attacks against people, adults and children. And then later on, after he got away from Northern Ireland, although the prime suspect for the murder of Arlene Arkinson, and he fled from there and travelled around extensively, he ended up in London in 2001, and he committed the same type of offence. He managed to lure a 14-year-old girl, Hannah Williams, from Lewisham in London, away from her family, and he murdered her. And her body wasn't found until 11 months later. And Howard's modus operandi would be that he would be in a relationship with a woman in the area, would be seemingly a harmless man, just simply known as Bob, Irish Bob or whatever, and would target children. And he somehow managed to get Hannah Williams to come meet him somewhere, and she was never seen alive again. And one of the chilling aspects of that particular murder was he had used a rope to murder her, and that was part of the evidence then in the murder trial, that he had a history of tying up his victims, and that was used as part of the prosecution evidence because it was an entirely circumstantial case, but he had a history of particularly violent crimes, and he was then convicted of that murder. And the frustration for everybody was that 7 years before he murdered Hannah Williams, we now can say, based on the inquest yesterday, what we've always believed, but that 7 years before he committed that murder in London, he murdered 15-year-old Arlene Arkinson in County Tyrone.
And the jury in his trial for murder of Arlene Arkinson wouldn't have been aware of the previous conviction for rape and murder, which I'm sure would have informed the decision there. Her body's never been found. Her family are looking for an inquiry into Robert Howard's activities in Northern Ireland. What do they want to know? What do they want an inquiry to look into, Barry?
They want to know how could this man have been living in the area and have been able to target a child like that. And also, as I mentioned, the fact that he was facing charges of raping a teenage girl in the area at that time. Later on, he pleaded guilty to lesser charges, which were accepted by the prosecution, and he got a suspended sentence. So this is a man who back in the early 70s had got a 10-year sentence for rape in the Republic of Ireland, and then gets a suspended sentence for a crime where he had held a girl for 3 days in an attack and got a suspended sentence. It defies logic to many people, and everybody wonders how could this have been, what was going on. Back then, of course, the frustration was that in 1994, the Gardaí and the RUC were not cooperating or talking to each other in the same way that perhaps the Gardaí and the PSNI talk now, certainly. This man was able to exploit borders, exploit the fact that various police forces were looking for him. He would move around, and there's a list of places that he would live. He was in Dublin, he was in Monaghan, he was in Bray, he was in Newry, he was in Castlederg, Glasgow, London. And one file I've seen, one note, Louise, is that this man, according to the Metropolitan Police, who had him under surveillance, was particularly surveillance conscious, and he would disappear for days on end. And I think everybody wants to know, what was he at? He was 20 years at large from 1981 until 2001. We now know he murdered 2 children in 2 jurisdictions. And the question is, what else might this man have done?
Okay, and Barry, as you say, the family looking for answers and an inquiry. We have a statement from the Department of Justice in Northern Ireland this morning to the programme saying, while fully appreciating that the past 27 years have been deeply traumatic for the Arkinson family as they've continued to grieve and search for answers on behalf of Arlene, the Minister, Naomi Long, has no powers in this respect, and any inquiry would be for the UK government to consider. Barry Cummins, thanks for bringing us those details this morning. It's 7:46.